Hello, everybody. So, as we get to the 1 month anniversary of Trump's second term in office, it's really fascinating to me how much he seems to want to destroy the United States and everything it stands for. He's doing his level best and doing it with alacrity to wreck all of our alliances with our friendly nations, to wreck our standing as a force of good and decency in the world, to coddle up and support the enemies of democracy and some, really nasty, brutal dictators around the world, and to wreck the economy at home, which actually was, not terrible when he took office. So, we can save for another day, I think, speculation as to why he's doing all of these things. Um, some people just attribute it to his lust for power and greed, but I think there's something darker in there. But I wanted to just focus this podcast on what the things that Trump is doing, which is very likely to lead to what's called stagflation, which, short of a major depression, is sort of the worst of all economic worlds. Stagflation is where an economy is stagnant. That is, it has low productivity, low GDP, high unemployment rate, but also there's a lot of inflation. Prices are going up, even though wages aren't really going up, and employment is getting worse. So the last time we had real stagflation in this country was back in the 1970s when Jimmy Carter was president. That's when that term was coined. The stagflation of the 70s was brought about in part by oil shocks. That's when the oil-producing nations of the world, like Saudi Arabia and Iran, formed a group called OPEC and tried to manipulate and control global oil prices, keeping their production of oil artificially low so that prices remained artificially high. And so there were actually shortages of oil from oil importing countries like the United States. So for those of you old enough to remember the mid-70s, you may remember gas lines and only being able to buy gas for your car every other day. How gas stations would run out of gasoline, and the price of everything was going up because energy is necessary to pretty much produce and transport everything we have. So as the price of energy went up and transportation went up, the price of everything else went up. So we had inflation, even though at the time the economy was actually pretty stagnant and we weren't really creating jobs very well. So we had this nasty period of time in the 1970s where inflation was really accelerating, but the average person was doing measurably worse, and the unemployment rate was actually fairly high. So I think that this situation, which is a terrible situation economically, could return under Trump because a lot of the policies he's pursuing domestically, which really seem designed to destroy the U.S. economy, could very well bring back stagflation. That is, could give us an unfortunate combination of inflation plus unemployment. Normally, by the way, when unemployment goes up, a lot of people are out of work, people don't have money to spend, so they don't spend money, and so businesses are then forced to cut their prices on things because they're trying to encourage people to buy stuff that they're just not buying. So normally there's sort of this seesaw balance between inflation and employment. When employment goes up, when unemployment, inflation and unemployment. When unemployment goes up, inflation tends to go down because people don't have money to spend. And when inflation goes up, usually it means that unemployment is going down, so people do have money to spend, and that's fueling the inflation. So there's normally an inverse or reverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. When one is higher, the other is usually lower. But when there's weird, unusual circumstances in the economy, you can get both at the same time, where they both go up. It's unusual, but it did happen in the 70s, and it's happened a few times in history, and it may happen again under Trump. So let me explain how his policies could bring back this horrible stagflation. First of all, his policies are quite inflationary. The tariffs that he's imposing on our friends and neighbors could lead to direct cost increases for retail. The import tariffs that he's imposing are paid for by U.S. companies that are importing goods. And since they now have to pay more for the goods they're importing, usually if they want to maintain their profit margins, they're going to have to pass most or all of that cost on to the consumer. So that causes a rise in consumer prices, which is inflationary. So tariffs are typically inflationary. Trump's immigration policy is likely to be quite inflationary because he's threatened to deport a lot of folks who are here illegally, but a lot of the folks who are here illegally are doing important jobs in important industries, and because they're not demanding, the kind of wage that probably a native-born person would demand, they're actually keeping the costs lower in those industries, and those lower costs can then be passed on to individuals. But if Trump really depopulates or scares away people from these industries like construction and agriculture, which are heavily reliant on illegal labor, then there just aren't going to be enough workers to do those jobs. So we're going to have shortages of things like housing and food. And also it's going to cost companies more to hire people to do those jobs. And again, they're likely to pass on those higher costs of labor in the form of higher prices for these goods. And for construction, it's going to be a bit of a nightmare because not only is it going to cost more to build things, because it's going to be harder to get workers for it, but we're in right now a sort of a housing crisis, which we've been in for a while, where we just don't have enough housing for all the people who want housing. And so home prices have gotten very expensive. And because a lot of people can't afford to buy homes, they're renting, and there aren't enough rentals for all these people, so rental prices have gotten very expensive. And depopulating the construction worker group is going to make that worse because we're not going to have the construction workers we need to build more housing so that we can alleviate some of that shortage of housing. And since we are not going to be able to reduce the shortage of housing because we just don't have the workers to build stuff, housing prices are going to remain high. Rents are going to remain high and may go even higher. So all of those things are quite inflationary. Of course, housing prices is usually the biggest single ticket item in a household budget, either a mortgage or a rent. And as those go up, you really see inflation spiking at the personal level. So the tariffs, the depopulation of the immigrant labor force, the worsening shortage of housing and rentals, all of that is going to make inflation much worse on an individual and household basis in the United States. So I know people were looking to Trump to bring down inflation. They didn't like the inflation under Biden, which was mostly due to the shortages of goods we had under COVID, when COVID shut down factories all over the world, basically. But this inflation that could happen under Trump is self-inflicted. We didn't have to impose tariffs. It's just something he wanted to do. We didn't have to, start mass deportations of immigrants. That's something he wanted to do. So this is a self-inflicted wound, but it's very likely to lead to higher household inflation, and by quite a bit, and you probably within a year or two. So there's our high inflation, but stagflation requires that we also have high unemployment. So how would that happen under Trump? Isn't he a pro-employment guy? Well, not if you're in the public sector. Right now, he's depopulating the public sector of the United States. That is, he's firing federal workers right and left. Or more accurately, he's getting his lackey, Elon Musk, to do that for him so that Musk can take the heat for it. But basically, the U.S. Federal government employs about 3 million people. And even if Trump only cuts the labor force by half, and it looks like he's actually going to cut by more than that, but that would be 1.5 million people out of work. Some of those people would get other jobs, but a lot of them wouldn't. The private sector is running at more or less full capacity right now and doesn't have space to absorb a sudden influx of 1.5 million workers. So just from that, you're looking at an increase in unemployment of 1 to 2%. And, a lot of people forget that when the government sector downsizes, the contractors who are hired by the government sector to, fulfill their needs, to build the things they need to get built, to do what they need to do, they lose work as well. Government contracts go away. So you shut down, for example, the U.S. aid, and you shut down a lot of government contracts. For example, U.S. aid provides food to starving people in other countries, but a lot of that food comes from our own farmers. So our own farmers have contracts with U.S. aid, and as U.S. aid shuts down, those contracts go away, and our own farmers lose income. They lose the government contracts. And so they then have to lay off farm hands, people who work for the farms, in order to cut their costs because they're not getting as much revenue now from the government. So one thing I think Trump and Musk forget, conveniently, is that a lot of these agencies they're trying to shut down or severely downsize have a lot of contracts with U.S. businesses. And, and those U.S. businesses aren't government employers. They're not the government. They're private contractors to the government. And so as these government contracts go away, there's not only a loss of jobs in the government sector from the people who've been fired, but there's also a loss of jobs in the private sector from the contractors who had contracted with the government, were expecting government money that's not going to come now. So that's bad for our business, and it's going to raise unemployment. So even if Trump, say, only quote unquote cut the government by 50%, as far as the workers go, the unemployment rate would probably go up by 3%. So, we're at, what are we at, 4% unemployment now. It could go up to 6 or 7%. That's high. That's not good. Also, there's the knock-on effect of inflation. Inflation tends to control itself to some extent normally, because as the prices of things get higher and higher, people buy fewer things, and that puts stress on retailers. For example, if people have less discretionary income every month because they're spending more on basics like rent, they're probably eating out less, which means that restaurants suffer loss of business, which means they have to lay off people. Restaurants close. There are layoffs in that sector. So between the knock-on effects of this artificially induced inflation up here and the direct firings of public sector workers, also leading to more unemployment in contractors of the federal government, which is a lot of private business in the U.S., you're looking at higher unemployment. At the same time, you're looking at higher inflation. So combined, those would give you stagflation, which is what made Jimmy Carter a one-term president, basically, back in the 1970s. He was president from 76 to 80. and he lost his job mostly because the economy was so lousy under him. The stagflation was bad, inflation was bad, but there was also low growth and unemployment, and so worst of all worlds, people didn't want any more of that. So they voted in Ronald Reagan in 1980. They made Jimmy Carter a one-term president. Now, theoretically, Trump can't run for another term because he's already served a term. This is his second term. So, although these days he's ignoring laws and constitutional amendments sort of at will, so who knows what's going to happen in 4 years. But I think that if the economy really goes into stagflation, that Trump's going to have a hard time surviving that, assuming there is another free and fair election for president. So I think ultimately it's Trump's own policies and the way they're going to sort of sledgehammer the U.S. economy and the average worker that, may well in the end do him in. And it puzzles me as to why he's doing this. I mean, I know superficially it's because he wants to free up money. He wants to shrink the government, free up money, maybe to give, more tax cuts to rich folks. But, that really doesn't fully explain, because you can do that without, busting the economy the way he's busting the economy with the things that he's doing. So it seems like he just wants to wreck us. I mean, just wreck us for the sake, I guess, of wrecking us and maybe taking some revenge on folks. I don't know. It's puzzling why a president of the United States would be so anxious to really damage the economy of the United States. That would seem to be the opposite of what a president would want to do. It's the opposite of what every president before Trump has wanted to do. So it's very puzzling. It almost makes you think that he's playing for a different team. Not a team that has our best interests in heart. Maybe he's playing for Team Russia. They want to see us go away. But all I can say is from where I sit here, his economic policies look like they have the potential to really, truly wreck the economy for the average U.S. worker. And that ain't good. So if you have, other ideas about how things are going to turn out here, I'd love to hear them. But, you'd have to deal with these realities here. If you have a counter argument, you have to deal with these realities in your current counter argument. I'd love to hear how they're wrong. Okay, so till next time, you take care.